ვებინარი მიმდინარეობს ფონდი ღია საზოგადოება საქართველოს მიერ დაფინანსებული პროექტის ფარგლებში და დღეს ეს უკვე არის რიგით მეორე დისკუსიების სერიისა, რომლის მიზანიც არის არალიბერალური ტენდენციების ანალიზი საქართველოში. ძალიან მცირე ინსტრუქცია უნდა მოგცეთ. დღევანდელი ვებინარი, ისევე როგორც ყველა ჩვენი სხვა ვებინარი, ორ ენაზე წარიმართება, ქართულად და ინგლისურად. ეკრანზე თქვენ ხედავთ, როგორ უნდა აირჩიოთ თქვენთვის სასურველი ენა, მას შემდეგ, რაც ჩაირთვება თარგმანის ფუნქცია. თქვენთან გამოჩნდება პატარა გლობუსი, რომელზე დაჭერითაც ინგლისურად მოსმენ, თუ გსურთ რომ მოისმინოთ ინგლისურად, ეს ვებინარი უნდა აირჩიოთ ინგლისური, ხოლო თუ გსურთ რომ მოისმინოთ ქართულად, უნდა აირჩიოთ გერმანული. დღევანდელი შეხვედრა ვიწერთ და ეს ჩანაწერი განთავსდება ჩვენ საიტზე და ასევე სოციალურ მედია არხებზე. შეხვედრა მას შემდეგ, რაც მომხსენებლები წარმოადგენენ თავიანთ პრეზენტაციებს, თქვენ შეგეძლებათ რომ კითხვა-პასუხის რეჟიმში ჩაერთოთ. პირველ რაუნდში კითხვების დასმა შეგიძლიათ წერილობითი ფორმით და ამისთვის შეგიძლიათ გამოიყენოთ Q&A ფუნქცია ან chat-ის ფუნქცია. სალომე კანდელაკი შეაჯამებს თქვენ შეკითხვების პირველ რაუნდში და მოახსენებს მათ სპიკერებს. ხოლო მას შემდეგ, რაც ისინი პასუხს გასცემენ, კითხვა-პასუხის რეჟიმის უკვე მეორე რაუნდში თქვენ მოგეცემათ საშუალება, რომ შეკითხვები პირადად დასვათ. ამისთვის უნდა გამოიყენოთ ხელისაწევის ფუნქცია და როცა ხელს აიწევთ, ჩვენ მოგცემთ საუბრის საშუალებას. ეხლა იგივე უნდა გავიმეორო მე ინგლისურად, იმიტომ რომ არაერთი არაქართულენოვანი დამსწრე ყავს და შემდეგ სიტყვას გადავცემ ბატონ კორნელი კაკაჩიას. I would like to welcome our non-Georgian speaker guests to the webinar, which is already a second discussion of the discussion series Analysing Illiberal Tendencies in Georgia. Thank you for your interest. Before we start the formal part, I would like to give you a short instruction about the language. The webinar will be held both in Georgian and in English, and once the interpretation function is on, you will see a little globe icon on your screen from which you have to select the language you would like to hear the webinar in. If you would like to hear it in English, you should choose English, obviously, from the options offered. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be placed on our social media channels as well as the website. Also, after the speakers present their speeches, you will have a chance to ask questions into two rounds. So the first round of Q&A session will be held based on the questions that come in written form. To ask questions in written, you can use either Q&A function of Zoom or the chat function. Salome Kandelaki will read your questions out loud in the first round of Q&A. In the second round of Q&A, you can ask questions yourself, and for that you will have to use the raise the hand function, and you'll be allowed to talk. I think with this, I will ask Dr. Cornel Kakachet for his opening remarks. Thank you.
დიდი მადლობა ნინო. მოგესალმებით საქართველოს პოლიტიკის ინსტიტუტის სახელით. მე გახლავართ კორნელი კაკაჩია, ამ ინსტიტუტის დირექტორი. როგორც ნინუცამ უკვე თქვა, პრინციპში ჩვენი დღევანდელი თქვა საჯარო დისკუსიების სერიის მეორე შეხვედრა, რომელიც არის სერია, ასე ვთქვათ, რომლის სახელი არის ანტილიბერალური ტენდენციების ანალიზი საქართველოში. დღეს გვაქვს მეორე ვებინარი და რომლის ასე ვთქვათ სახელწოდება არის ნიშნავს თუ არა ნაციონალიზმი ევროსკეპტიზმს. ეს საკითხი არის საკმაოდ მნიშვნელოვანი ისეთი ქვეყნების როგორიც არის საქართველო და აღმოსავლეთ პარტნიორობის ქვეყნების უმრავლესობა ალბათ თუ არ ვიტყვით კიდე რომ შეიძლება აღმოსავლეთ ევროპის ქვეყნებისთვისაც იქიდან გამომდინარე რომ ქართულ კონტექსტში თქვენი ციტო საქართველო პოზიციონირებს როგორც აღმოსავლეთ პარტნიორობის ერთ-ერთი წამყვანი ქვეყანა, რომლის ძირითადი ასე ვთქვათ ენერგია ბოლო აწეულობის განმავლობაში მიმართულია ევროპული ასე ვთქვათ მისწრაფებებისკენ და ცდილობს ქვეყანა რომ ფეხი აუგას ამ ევროპეიზაციის პროცესს და ეს არის ასე ვთქვათ ოფიციალური ქვეყნის საგარეო პოლიტიკის, ასე ვთქვათ, მთავარი მამოძრავებელი ძალა, ბუნებრივია ამ კონტექსტში ჩვენთვის ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანია
trends. So this is the biggest challenge. That is why the trends, non-liberal trends, are very important. The trends that accompany the process, and we know that it is not just happening in Georgia. Those processes happen in other countries. In this region, in other regions, and that is why it's so important for us to discuss and to know better about the impact of those non-liberal trends on the Europeization of Georgia and an overall social and political situation and the future of the country. That's the point of the webinar. It is being funded by the Open Society Georgian Foundation, and we are very happy that the topic has attracted a lot of attention. So this was briefly about the goals and the topics. We'd like to inform you that we are very lucky to have one of the best panels. So we have two keynote speakers. The first is Mr. Professor Florian Bieber. Many of you know him and know his publications. He's a professor at Southeast European History and Politics and the director of the Center of the Southeast European Studies at the University of Christ. He coordinates the Balkan in Europe Policy Advisor Group. His research interest includes inter-ethnic relations, ethnic conflict, and nationalism, focusing on Southeastern Europe. Professor Bieber will discuss whether far-right nationalism drives Euroscepticism in general. So he's also the editor-in-chief of one of the scientific journals, and it is quite interesting for the PhD students to know, because the PhD students are always looking for some of the interesting journals to publish the works. I would also like to introduce another keynote speaker, Mr. John Hall. Mr. Hall, a professor of comparative historic sociology at McGill University. He is the author or editor of over 20 books. His research area is nation states and empires, nationalism and war, the economic consequences of the size of nations, so sociological theory. In his speech, he will provide an overview of the practices of different states by drawing particular attention to the reasons leading the societies to European skepticism. As I mentioned, he's the author of different works and books, and he's also the professor at the Copenhagen University. He also used to be the dean of the art faculty. And his book, As Kellner, Intellectual Biography, that was published in 2000. It was nominated as a candidate for the Overall Prize. I would also like to very proudly introduce my former students, Givi Sulakadze and Keti Satania. I used to teach them at the Populist State University. Givi Sulakadze is the analyst at the Georgian Institute of Politics since 2019. He has a master's degree in political science. Together with a master's degree, his specialization is social analysis. So the interests is the research methodology, and populism, Euroscepticism. He used to work on those topics, and he continues to work on analyzing this area. So Keti Sartania, he's a freelance researcher. Since 2014, he was part of different think tanks and sociological research groups. and his topic is about the ethnic minorities and internally displaced persons, post-socialist transformation, urbanism, and so on and so forth. So she's also the author of several articles and several papers, and also the co-author. Right now, she acts as a freelance scholar and researcher. So this is very briefly about our keynote speakers. Now I would like to move forward and give the floor to the first speaker, to Professor Bieber. Each speaker will have 10 minutes. And so 2 minutes before the end, I will give you a heads up so that we have 2 minutes remaining. So let's do our best to fit into the 10-minute time. I'm absolutely sure everybody is 100% punctual and now we'll fit into the time. Thank you. Professor Bieber, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also giving me a chance to participate in this seminar. I think it's a timely and interesting topic, and I'm particularly curious to hear perspectives from Georgia on this issue. Let me structure my remarks in three different directions or three different points. The first one is how strong are the kind of Eurosceptic nationalist parties? The second one, are they Eurosceptic or what are they? And the third one is looking at what has been the impact of COVID-19 on this dynamic. Now, the first one is one which is, of course, you could say both easy and hard to identify. You know, what is a nationalist party is very difficult because scholars of nationalism would hold that nationalism permeates society in a way that most parties accept the nation-state framework, so determining what is nationalist or not nationalist might be not very helpful. So rather, we can look at parties which are Eurosceptic and which are basically parties which oppose close cooperation with other countries in Europe in terms of shifting sovereignty upwards to the European Union. And if we look at these parties, also parties which are in favor of, for example, stronger border controls and for anti-immigrants, and the package of different measures which we see, we can observe that there's been a significant increase of those parties across the European Union. I've done a kind of an analysis to look at the number of members of the European Parliament from such parties. Now, of course, they include a very wide range of parties. They include on one extreme something like Golden Dawn in Greece, which is, it could be called a neo-fascist or neo-Nazi party, which has also a very violent street fighting, so to say, dimension, to more mainstream parties like Fidesz in Hungary, which is a member of the European People's Party, but at the same time has been engaging in a very nationalist, isolationist rhetoric. If we take all of those parties together, and again, categorization might be varying, but I would think the trend is quite clear. Those parties jointly had around 5.8% of all MEPs in the European Parliament in 1994. Their share has increased to 22.5% in last year's European Parliament elections. In 2014, their share was 16%. In 2009, around 8.5%. So basically, we can say that the share of far-right nationalist MEPs in the European Parliament has more than doubled in the last 10 years and makes up something around a quarter of the members of the European Parliament now. Their effectiveness is disproportionately low in comparison to their size, partly because they're scattered across a whole range of different party families. Some are in the European People's Party, some are with European Conservatives, some are with the far-right grouping of Identity and Nation, some are not affiliated. This is one of the big, maybe hopeful signs, is that the far-right and nationalist parties are often have a hard time of cooperation because they seek effective alliances. So, for example, in the case of Hungary is case in point, where Viktor Orban's Fidesz party has not been leaving the European People's Party because that provides it with protection in their national framework, rather than associating itself with other far right-wing parties like the Lega in Italy or similar parties like the FPÖ in Austria, the Freedom Party. So, that notwithstanding, the strength of these parties is clear and it's been rising. these parties, although one should keep in mind, are volatile. These are not stable parties very often and undergo high fluctuations. Just to illustrate that, in Austria, we had a far-right party which was part of government until last year, and that party has collapsed in electoral support to less than half where it was a year and a half ago, largely due to a whole slew of scandals. So these parties are, let's say, more volatile than established, quote-unquote, mainstream parties. Now, the second question I want to address is, are these parties anti-European? And I think here we find an interesting paradox. Now, of course, they are Eurosceptic in many ways, but Eurosceptic should be a better term, EU-skeptic. So in the past, these parties often define themselves against their neighbors, against the European project. But I would argue that in recent years, the nationalist and far-right parties have discovered Europe. Which what I mean with it is they don't become big supporters of EU integration, and Brussels is still a code word for for anti-European rhetoric. But they are rather trying to occupy or colonize the idea of Europe through their own understanding. What I mean with that is that there is basically nobody who is in favor of any Brexit-like scenario. There's no more strong support for Frexit or any other incarnations across the European Union. And there are two reasons. First of all, the Brexit experience has been traumatizing for Britain and for those who support the idea, but also that those far-right parties often exist in a symbiotic relationship with the European Union. They often benefit from the financial assistance and the economic integration and don't want to forego this. So rather what they're doing is they're arguing for a different Europe. Now, it's not only the pragmatic reasons, there's also an ideological reason. And I think this is maybe even more interesting and more important, that as the main enemy for those parties is not neighbors, it's not nationalism directed against neighbors or classical minorities, but usually against another which is non-European. Migrant and Islam are the two biggest themes. And that allows for a kind of European rhetoric. So, for example, in Germany, the protest movement Pegida, which erupted in Eastern Germany a few years ago, was called Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of Europe, or in fact, the term used is the Abendland, the Occident. Now, so they used deliberately the term Europe, Patriotic Europeans, although this movement was nearly exclusively East German, but because calling yourself nationalist Germans doesn't sound very good, but patriotic Europeans sounds very good. But it's not just a rhetorical plot, it's also the idea that basically these movements on the far right often frame themselves as defending Europe. So also Viktor Orban in his rhetoric very often, while being EU skeptic, proposes a different Europe, a Europe of nation states and an anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant Europe. So in a certain way, he tries to promote the idea that he's not just a Hungarian politician, but he's a European politician who has a different vision of Europe. So I think this is important to recognize, because this has two consequences. On one side, they're not going to be EU skeptic and such in terms of rejecting the European Union. They want to change the European Union from within. So in a certain way, they're adopting as kind of subverting the European project. So if you're an optimist, you can say, great, they are in fact becoming pro-European, at least in the sense that they are not rejecting integration as such. But the dangerous side of this is, of course, that they're trying to, in a certain way, reclaim Europe and the narrative of Europe for their own tool, which is one which is profoundly against many of the basic principles of European integration and the values of the Treaty of the European Union, which is about a rule of law, democracy, and human rights, which includes also the protection of those who are in a weaker and in a minority position. So I think what we're seeing in Europe now is not so much Europe, pro-European versus anti-European, but rather a debate about what Europe means and how Europe should be defined or not defined. And that is, in a certain way, a much more important debate. And then I will conclude with two thoughts on the COVID-19 crisis. So the first indication seems to be that the pandemic, of course, has pushed populist parties down in support, because many of them have found to be anti-expert and bumbling and not being very effective in dealing with the pandemic. So in Britain or elsewhere, of course, also anti-immigrant topics were not very high in the list of priorities in these months. So parties like the AfD in Germany or FPÖ in Austria could not capitalize on their classic anti-immigrant rhetoric. But at the same time, I would argue that that they are still potent once the normality returns and people's vulnerabilities as a result of the pandemic becomes a key issue. Furthermore, what is interesting and striking is that their criticism of Europe has been actually one which is paradoxical. Their criticism of Europe has been one saying, and also if you look at surveys among citizens in France, citizens in Italy are extremely disappointed with the European Union. They will say, there were recent polls saying that the EU had no contribution to fighting the pandemic and that they're disappointed by the European Union. But this is a different type of disappointment than we've seen earlier. So this is the classical Eurosceptic theme in the past was always Europe does too much. There's too much Europe superstate, which is interfering with our lives. What we're seeing now is that they're saying Europe is not doing enough. The main criticism of the European Union in the light of the COVID crisis is that the European Union is too passive, doesn't have enough competences, and is not displaying enough cross-national solidarity. So this is quite interesting because it actually means that Eurosceptics want more Europe, not less Europe, at least those surveyed. But I think what is kind of worrying in this is that if this coincides, this merges with the narratives of a different Europe among the far-right and nationalist parties of Europe, this can lead to actually a destructive vision of Europe in a certain way, one which is based on nation states and directed with a clear external enemy. And we see hints of that already in the Europeans' policy towards its external borders. So in that sense, I think it's no longer a debate between Eurosceptics and pro-European liberal Democrats, but rather one's about nationalists and far-right claiming Europe for their own narratives. And that is a Europe which is very different from the Europe which the European Union has been building in recent decades. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for a very interesting opening. So now, to the extent I understood, Euroscepticism is not an easy thing to define, and that is why it's so interesting to study the phenomena and not just immediately label it with some cliches. In our region, this is just at the beginning. We're just starting to learn about those movements, and also to some shape or to some extent, there are some reform ideas coming out of them. Of course, there are some threats, some risks, but it's so interesting. We need to accept that phenomena and try to understand them the way they exist, not the way we want them to be shaped or exist. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor John Hall. And so, Professor, would you mind to share your ideas with us, and then we will move to the Georgian part. And could you please speak a bit slowly?
It's a pleasure to be here. I don't know Georgia very well, so I won't comment on your local politics. I'll make some more general comments. It's always difficult following Professor Bieber, who's characteristically illuminating already, but I have one advantage. My background is in Great Britain, one of the most Eurosceptic countries of all, so I can reflect on that. I have three things to say. The first thing is that I will take up the main question, which in a certain sense he avoided by nuancing it, by making it a bit more complicated. Is it the case that being nationalist makes you Eurosceptic? And here I think there's a very clear answer and an important answer. The answer is no, certainly not. And I can illustrate this in many ways, but here's one way of doing so. Some time ago, there was debate in Denmark as to whether it should join the euro, the European currency. And there was a clear fight inside the society between all of the political elite, the newspapers, the unions, both political parties, more than two political parties, and the opposition, which had some intellectuals in, but mostly it was outside Copenhagen. But the point about this is that both sides were nationalist. The ones who wished to join the European Union, the elite which wished to join, said this is the best route that Denmark should take. Denmark will prosper. They lost, and particularly males outside Copenhagen won. The Eurosceptic vote won, but the side which wished to be in Europe to a greater extent was stressing that this is a way in which the nation can prosper. So I think the analytic point is that there are different meanings, of course, to the word nationalist. And we should have some sort of range in our mind. Maybe at one end of such a range, you can see people who are Europeans or cosmopolitans who really dislike nationalism completely. It's easy to think of people in that category. Refers to the philosopher Jürgen Habermas. The late 19th century, it was very often Jewish intellectuals scared of nationalism because new nation states wouldn't give them a place. So there are cosmopolitans. A Spanish writer, Medrano, has written a book about marriages between people in different European countries. He's very much in favor of a European identity. But most of our evidence shows that people's identity is still via their nation state, but in most of Europe, people have dual identities. They're European to a certain extent, often opportunistically. The higher social class, the more you're likely to have some identity like that. But they are in an international organization, so cosmopolitan, international, states doing well out of Europe. And then there's the Eurosceptic ones which wish to actually leave the European Union altogether. And that's my second point. If you look at, I was asked to comment on where does the Eurosceptic voice comes from? It's not entirely simple. A lot of it is to do with history. In the British case, you have to remember it's not completely a movement from below. It's a movement to a certain extent at the top. It's from people like Boris Johnson, who live in a country which felt that it won the Second World War, felt that it doesn't really need to be part of Europe. The most famous headline was always that of the First World War, fog in the Channel, continent isolated. There's that imperial character to the English upper class. But we do know from many countries, with a lot of variation, who it is at the bottom that these leaders can sometimes speak to. And we know this is very often people who are left out, not in cities, suffering economically, insofar as Europe depends upon high-level skills, different languages, the ability to move around inside the European Union. People at the bottom of society who don't have those skills can resent the opportunities that people above them have. This pattern is very clear in the United States, where I live, where I'm speaking from, but it's a general pattern. It's the people who are left out who can provide the fodder for these movements. So that's my second point. I'll summarize the first one again by saying that many, many people in Europe have dual identities. They're partly European, but mostly in favor of their nation states. But the nation state is a way, Europe is a way in which their nation states can prosper. The final thing that I wanted to say, because I was asked to say something about it, is in some way or another will lead to violence. Professor Bieber has mentioned one of these groups, which is potentially violent, has been violent, and of course all of them have small incidents of violence. But the word fascism should be used very carefully, and I would maintain that the situation now is really nothing like that. Fascists in the 1920s and early 1930s depended upon a particular recruiting pattern. Recruiting pattern was of ex-soldiers who could become paramilitaries, who knew how to organize and how to fight, and that is not our world. Thank goodness, at the moment, There are all sorts of unpleasant things that can happen, and there can be some violence, but it will not be violence to the same level or to the same extreme. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting speech. So the way you mentioned this dualism, it's so interesting, and we can say that in Georgia we also have the case of dual identity, and sometimes it's even the triple identity, we can call it, because the taste, the aspirations of the groups are quite amazing, because some of them identify themselves with like a more pro-Russian, and then identify through a religious background. There are groups that subscribe under the nationalist groups, but they say we do not support pro-Russian. We are more like a Georgian, pro-Jordan, and we support Georgia's joining the EU. So there are so many peculiar details and nuances into those different pictures. Now I would like to smoothly move to the next speaker, Givi. He actually analyzed the topic, but I would also like to remind our participants to post their questions into the chat window, and then we will collect those questions and read them out loud for the speakers. And on the second round of questions, you will be allowed to speak for yourself and raise hands. Good afternoon. It's really very difficult to say something interesting after those two extraordinary speakers. But I'll try to, and I'll try to focus on populism, because in my research, populism was the focal point, and after populism, I will move to nationalist populism and then Euroscepticism. Immediately, I would like to mention that in Georgian political discourse, populism is used as something non-realistic, some steps that the political parties are using to gain as many voters as they want, as they can. The academic definition is quite different, and recently I really doubt whether we should use this term in the academic environment, because recently I've been into inconvenient situations when this term is understood differently, and then it just destroys the whole dialogue. So what I mean under populism is ideology in a very narrow sense. Of course, there are different opinions that it is just a type of a discourse or the strategy, etc. But in academic groups, despite of all the differences, there is one foundation. And the foundation is, for populism, three key concepts are important. People, elite, and the will of the society. And the populist, in any political system, a populist believes that people are oppressed, ignored by elite, and the idea of the politics is to help these people realize themselves. So this is like a brief mental map of the way populists see the social events happening around them. But those concepts of people, of elite, the will of the people, they mean nothing. They're quite empty. So what exactly do we mean by people, or by elite, or the will of the people? It depends on each individual context, and most obviously, it depends on the ideology that is being used. Now let's talk about nationalism, now national populism and nativism, nationalism and nativism, which is one of the subforms. Here, the key focus is on the cultural markers and indicators. So, for instance, these nativist people mean two different things. And those two different meanings or concepts are quite, they have the ability to coexist. So people oppressed, suffering, but morally standing over. And the second, people, the nation as the group having the same cultural and ethnic background. So in my work, I've identified 4 key populist actors, and of course this list is not exhaustive, and besides those 4 populist actors, you can mention many others, but just to look at all that from the perspective of most relevance and the strength of impact, those 4 are most active. 2 are the political parties, 2 actors, and 2 are the public active public persons. And before I talk about them in detail, just want to briefly provide you with the definition of Euroscepticism. I just took the definition which is used in the European Union context and tried to adjust it to the Georgian reality. So Euroscepticism in the academic fields, it is understood in the context of the member states and also the candidate state. But Georgia is neither the member state of the European Union nor the candidate. That's why I'm not really able to easily copy and paste it into Georgian. So I took the typology of Tadariak and it is talking about the hard Euroscepticism and soft Euroscepticism. And in Georgian context, hard Euroscepticism is when a person strongly disagrees and tries to fight the European integration, and the soft Euroscepticism is that you are not openly fighting against it, but you're just expressing your discontentment, your unhappiness about some of the European trends and political developments. So a soft Eurosceptic is the actor who believes that Georgia's integration into European Union does not match with the national interests of Georgia. So I mentioned I had identified 4 populist actors, and only 1 out of 4 is not Eurosceptic. And this actor is defined as the left-wing social skepticism representative, which is the Labour Party of Georgia. They don't give a lot of meaning to the Euro integration if you look into the election programs. If you look into the previous election program, there was only 1 sentence talking about the Euro integration. The other populist actors, all 3 of them are quite Eurosceptics, and we can say that they have a very strong nationalist ideas. And only 1 out of 3 is the political party, which is the Patriot Alliance of Georgia. The Patriot Alliance is a soft skeptic. So they do not openly fight Georgia's integration into European Union, and the proof is that if you look into their 2012 political action program, they clearly state that they support Georgia's integration into European Union. But if you just listen to the statements the leaders of the parties make in the public, quite often they talk about the price Georgia pays to become the member of the European Union. They also try to underline that Georgia's national interests might not coincide with the path that Georgia has chosen. And they also talk about the values, Georgian values, and also the European values, which are not the same as Georgian and are not really evenly distributed. The 2 other populist actors, which are the public figures or actors and groups, they are hard Euroscepticism cases. So I mentioned 2 political parties, and I offered you the analysis of their political programs, but the social activist groups, they don't really have those official election programs, right? And I talked to different experts to define the background and their program, and now all of the experts agreed with my findings. So in a conclusion, I can say that populism in Georgia does not automatically mean Euroscepticism. And a good example is the Labour Party, because they are Eurosceptic and they also are quite populist. But also the Euroscepticism does not automatically mean populist, because we have one party, a Democratic Movement for Georgia, which is quite Eurosceptic, but is not populist party. So if we move from a very narrow definition of populism to a more specific, for instance, a nationalistic or nativist populism, then we will see that those out of 4 actors, those nationally populists, they are also Eurosceptics. at the same time. But it's not that simple, of course. And I would just like to echo the statements made by Professor Hall and Professor Bieber. And it's the same in Georgia. National populists that are in Georgia, they try to always underline and sympathize with this European awakening. And what they mean is that those, extreme rights forces that start to become stronger and stronger during the last decade, and they're distinguished with or we can mention Orban. And at the end, I would like to say that national populism in theory and also in Georgia is not totally anti-democratic in its direct and simple sense. I mean, it's underlying this, national sovereignty and rule of majorities. But national populism is anti-liberal, and what I mean is that it is against the liberal norms and values. For instance, tolerance, diversity, minority rights, constitutionalism. The checks and balances between different branches of the state. And also in Georgia, if we look at the nationalist actors or even nativist actors, quite often they put themselves against the constitutional principles, against the majority. So that sensitive balance that exists in liberal democracy, I mean, between the rule of majority and or between constitutionalists, it is always the target for the national populists to attack. I mean, the balance that does not allow the majority to infringe the rights of the minorities. For populists, this is that becomes the leverage. And just very at the end, I would like to again mention European Union. For Georgian national populists, Euro integration is not of a primary importance. And if they fight Euro integration, it usually happens when they want to underline some liberal values which are pertinent to the Western world, and it is so unacceptable for Georgian traditional person. And it is their interpretation, of course, that it is not acceptable. Of course, it's not an objective reality. Thank you. Thank you, Givi. Thank you for a very interesting analysis that was about the Georgian national populist groups. I would like to add, you mentioned it already, and you underlined that those groups, certain form of internationalization happens, and these groups they develop some linkage between Western. So a couple of months ago, there was this tragic event happening in New Zealand, and they found some Georgian scripts on this scene, the crime scene or the incident scene. It was like a medieval Georgian king's statement, like a quote. So what I mean to say is that those movements, those groups, they tend to get in touch with one another. It's they are under the process of internationalization, and it is quite interesting. I would like to now give the floor to Ms. Keti Sartania to speak about her research, her findings. So please. Good afternoon. Thank you for introducing me. And the professors, they provided an excellent opening, and it is the best opening that allows me now to give you the results of my research. So, I will be talking about media and social media, which is Facebook. And in order to conduct my research, I use the different tools. More than 20,000 posts were collected from the social media, which is Facebook at this point. And I will be talking about the finding, and I will link it with the title of today's webinar. As I told you, more than 20,000 Facebook posts were collected and analyzed, and we could see that different social groups, different political parties, or the supporters to political parties, they choose the same, one and the same topics to discuss. And one of the topics is Europe. We are not calling it European Union, it is Europe. It is polysemantic in Georgia. In Georgian context, Europe, the term Europe is polysemantic. But in general, when these groups would talk about Europe, I mean, nationalist and also ultra-nationalist, they mean the end of European civilization, when those groups from Georgia were supporting those ultra-conservative groups, their trends, their steps in politics and also in social groups. Because for those groups in Georgian environment, the only way that they can distribute their idea is Facebook. So polysemantic, I mentioned, and so first meaning that Europe has it is European Union, and also Georgia's attitude towards the European Union and Georgia's politics. And it is about like ethnic minorities, equality, NGOs, different activists, liberal media, outlets, and also migrant policy was one of the important policies that was very negatively loaded. Second meaning that Europe has is that Europe as a Christian civilization, which is a historic family for Georgia. So these groups with anti-Muslim and anti-immigration inclinations, they use this definition to contradict to those, to Muslim groups and migrants groups. So when we talk about Georgian modern ultra-nationalism, the translation is very important. The professors were talking today, and in those countries, in your respective countries, the trend is different now. And the terminology is also different. It's not the case in Georgia right now, because groups, these groups, they try to demonstrate their Euroscepticism in a daily routine, in daily life. So European Union policies are demonstrated in Georgia by the activities of NGOs, and these groups, they try to fight against those NGOs, and that is why they think that European Union is a threat to Georgian nationalist classical identity. But from the territorial integration perspective, it also means security and protection, because European Union for Georgia also means protection of your territorial integrity. And on the one hand, they see European Union as the threat to traditional Georgian family culture and identity, etc. But on the other hand, Europe, from political perspective, is very interesting for ultra-nationalist groups, and three countries are the role models for Georgia and for those groups. It's France, Marine Le Pen, Orban, and there was a third one I couldn't hear which one. And for the Georgian groups, these three countries and their policies are more interesting than the total of European Union. And maybe that's the reason of Euroscepticism, because they see those three countries as more stronger, more brave in making their decision about the issues that they are interested in. I mean, the migrants and minority issues, and European nationalist leaders, they don't see those leaders making the decisions very brave and very open. And for Georgian context, these groups are no news, because since the day we regained our independence, in these last 3 decades, these groups have been here, and these groups are always fighting against like minority groups, migrants groups. In past, they would just fight them in the streets, but since the last decade, it has broadened, because we have internet, we have different social networks and platforms, and the discussion has moved to this virtual environment, and many of the groups were formed in in the internet, and the reason why they created themselves and put themselves into the social media was that they were not able to establish themselves into the traditional environment, and now they created those groups, and these are the enthusiasts that work in the net only. And sometimes you can see them as very neutral, because and you might think that they're not influenced by any political ideas or political party, because they're just talking about some ideology, like in general terms. But later, if you go into debates and discussions with them, you will see and this is maybe because of the recent trends. For instance, before we regained independence, these topics were not really not really relevant. I would like to also mention 2008 and the war of 2008. So we talked to the representatives of the groups, and they we had this idea, and they just confirmed it. 2008 was the new wave of nationalists, with many young people joining the groups. And I also want to link this issue with the international organizations and their policy towards Georgia. And in the society, there was the expectation that if Georgia would face some threat, territory-wise or otherwise, the international organizations would immediately intervene. And in 2008, there was a certain amount of disappointment for these groups. Just long story short, in Europe, nationalist groups are not Eurosceptics, but I can say the contrary in Georgian context. In Georgia, ultra-nationalist groups are very actively using Eurosceptic attitudes, and it is also expressed in the cultural part. But politically, I subscribe to the idea that yes, they support European Union policy, but more nationalist policy. And last year we had a very good example of that. 2019 Euro Parliament elections, and Georgian nationalist groups were very actively supporting European nationalist parties, and they were openly expressing their support towards them. The very last two definitions. Nationalist Euroscepticism first, and you can see it's obvious in the narrative, and also civic Euroscepticism. So, and I will tell you what I mean. National Euroscepticism, it is viewed as and is supported by the threat people see. Threat to like cultural identity and family unit, etc. But civic, it could be the same threat, but the threat could be traded for something important. I mean, social support, territorial integrity, and that exactly is confirmed by the poll that happened in 2019. 53% of the respondents said that European Union is a threat to Georgian traditions and cultures. I would also like to define national Euroscepticism in a second way. It is the threat of migrants. It was not a big influx, but there was still some demonstrations on the main avenue. On the one hand, protesters protesting against the events happening in the European Union, and on the other hand, they were trying to depict it and show it as a threat to Georgia. Because if it already happens in Europe, if Georgia becomes a member of the European state, the same will be happening in Georgia. That was the narrative. And as the country Georgia is very small, there are very few people living here. It's a big threat. So, with regards to civil Euroscepticism, now I want to talk about the corruption, embezzlement, or misappropriation of the funds provided by the European Union to Georgia. And again, it is the ideas collected from people, last year's data. And the last Europe in its historic sense. And nationalist groups subscribe to that, and also on the other hand, for self-nationalists who are also quite skeptical for some reasons towards the European policies or European policy targeted towards Georgia, but despite of that, they still see some benefits. I mean, as a safeguard of territorial integrity. And thank you, Katie, for interesting speech. So it's some kind of advanced nationalism. We are not yet the members of the European Union, and they're already starting to worry about the things that might happen in a future. So let's take the first round of questions because we don't have much time, and I would like to now give the floor to Salome to read the questions. And before we do that, I would like to remind all of the participants. For the second round, you can use the raise the hand function. You can see it on the main panel. And immediately you will be given the word. Thank you, Mr. Corneli. So we have several questions, and these are the questions in Georgian, and I will be asking them in Georgian, and of course you will get the translation. First question is to Professor Bieber. So, and the idea is, so in European Union, the Eurosceptic trends and anti-liberal trends in majority of the European member states could be seen as the alternative and modern reality, which was created after this post-Second World War environment. And also, do you agree to the idea that in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, the parties are like fragmented and they are limited to their social sources, or is it just part of their discourse, I mean, about politics? So these two questions were to Professor Bieber. If you did not take the question, I will ask her to repeat them in a slower pace because she's reading very fast. And the second question goes to the from Jürgen Grovenwild, again to Professor Bieber, and the question is, so can you describe nationalists in countries like Georgia? What do they represent? I mean, still or focused on liberal Europe and still fighting to protect the values such as democracy, rule of law, human rights, equality, and so on and so forth. Because he believes that the European Union, despite of the non-liberal trends and moving towards non-liberal trends, in regards to Georgia, it still looks different, and those non-liberal groups are not really friendly towards European Union. We're talking about Georgian non-liberal groups, and as a result, there will be a deeper integration. So in our case, the context is different, so we can talk about that. The next question comes from Valerik Alandadze. The title is, does nationalism mean Euroscepticism? And the term nationalism is not well defined. According to Cambridge Dictionary, there is a different definition. It is like, aiming towards a political independence. So it was a comment. So we need to immediately define nationalism when we talk about nationalism and nationalist. Misha Shavtoladze. And his question about ultra-nationalist groups and the COVID-19 context, if the ultra-nationalist groups narrative has become stronger in COVID-19 era, and are they trying to strengthen their discourse? We're talking about this no limitations to traveling, etc. So I guess we have enough of the questions. for now, and Samkharadze also has a question, and she will pose the question herself. And David Matsaberidze and Renat also have questions. So far we can take the questions that we have already, and later we will ask those three to ask questions. So as we are limited in time, like you will have maximum 3 or 4 minutes, but you need to speak slow in order for me to be able to translate. Okay. So Professor Bieber, the floor is yours first, and please.
Thank you. Some excellent questions, which are hard to answer so quickly. I mean, I think the first point is maybe definitional, one about what is nationalism. Of course, as John Hall also said, I mean, it's very much depends on how we define it. I think what I was also trying to say, nationalism permeates politics in contemporary world in all aspects. So as soon as we operate within a nation state, we operate with thinking about our own citizens in terms of political agenda setting. And all of this could be described as nationalism. I think what we're mostly talking about is some kind of exclusionary nationalism, which is not directed at, which is often directed against others, and this also elevates and claims a monopolistic relationship of citizens to the nation. So it does not tolerate the kind of multiple levels of identity which John Hall was talking about, which the European Union entails. So you can be a nationalist in a certain way, a European nationalist, which says a community is open and we can coexist with the European Union as another level of identity. And exclusionary nationalists would say, first of all, if you're not a member of a particular community, often defined by descent, you're out, and we don't tolerate other levels of identity besides the nation, at least not as important ones. I think the question I want to pick out is what, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on Georgia. I'm mostly working on the Balkans and the accession process there. But one thing I've always found striking is that, of course, EU accession there, unlike, let's say, in Britain, is often framed as a way to restore or maintain sovereignty, because the experience of countries in the Caucasus, as well as in the Balkans, is often one that they are subjects of international politics, subject of great powers, and that the European Union, the European integration, Euro-Atlantic integration as well, NATO membership, for example, is a way to restore or maintain sovereignty, because it allows them to co-shape the organizations of which they would be a subject of otherwise, or be co-shaped by other actors, not to mention, whether it's Russia, China, Turkey, or so on. So in that sense, you can be a pro-European nationalist in the sense of you're arguing as a way to protect your national sovereignty. But of course, there's so in that sense, I think these are not necessarily, the narratives are not necessarily incompatible. We saw this also in Eastern Europe and Central Europe when Poland, Hungary, often this idea of the return to Europe was a very strong motif to say, to prove the national distinction from the Russian dominance of the Cold War era was reasserting sovereignty and nationhood by joining the European Union. Once that has been achieved, then of course we see a kind of skepticism, which is connected with, I think, the sense that the peripheral or economically and politically less equal position in the European Union persists. That of course, not all member states are equal in terms of economic might, political influence, and as a result, there's a certain disillusionment. But I think a lot of it is also the result of the general sense of lack of control. Nationalism offers a return of control to the nation state, which is of course illusionary, but is one which exclusionary nationalists promise by externalizing the culprits and claiming to represent the nation. And this is, I'll just conclude with one sentence about the question about COVID-19 and how that links to that. I think the closure of borders and the isolation which many people experience is not a victory of nationalism. It's a certain way a byproduct, but it actually highlights also what, in many ways we saw in recent months what Europe would look like without the European Union. Closed borders, uncertainty, everybody watching the news whether they can go on holidays because one country might retaliate. If you look at interwar Europe, there was a lot of this borders closure, only some people could move and others not. This, in a certain way, is a Europe without the European Union, and I don't think people like it very much. much. I don't think people say this is great, this is what we've always dreamed of having a Europe where we don't know where we can travel, where we don't know whether we can cross borders, where we're constantly in a state of anxiety and uncertainty, where we're reminded that we need our passports and documents and maybe tests and maybe not. So in that sense, I don't think it's a victory of the nation state. It's rather the inevitable consequence of the pandemic and the structures, but it's not, I don't think citizens have become more convinced that the nation state is fantastic and the best, kind of a closed autarkic nation state is the framework in which they would like to live in. So again, the future will show, but I don't see that as a clear outcome of the crisis.
Professor Hall, quote machine.
Professor Hall, the floor is yours now.
You should unmute.
Please unmute yourself. Oh, okay.
Now you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm very much in agreement with those last comments. The Cambridge University dictionary definition of nationalism being independent is not really a very good definition at all. At the end of the 19th century, the great powers in Europe tried to be independent geopolitically, economically, etc., and it was a catastrophe. That world has been replaced, except for the United States, by one in which people's greatest level of independence is through sharing. No European state is geopolitically, militarily powerful and independent. It can't be. So the European Union is an organization which gives far greater independence, far greater protection than certainly the small states in Europe have ever known. A small state over many areas has veto power over the whole of the European Union. So proper definition should be that nationalism wants to get as much political autonomy as possible. That doesn't mean total independence. Total independence in the world in which we live, when only a couple of countries have real nuclear capacity, is not possible at all. So the European Union has been enormously beneficial, particularly for small countries which have this veto power. I have a couple of other comments. One of them is, if I may, to warn us to be perhaps a little bit careful about this expression illiberal, as if there are angels and devils in the political world. I think it is very important to try and understand why it is that people are Eurosceptic. So I'd like to return to what I said before, that the European Union is a larger world in which people with great skills can swim around with excellent language skills and so on. The people left behind are not necessarily completely nasty and vicious and deep down right wing and so on. We have to listen to them in some ways. In normative terms, it's crucial to design a Europe in which they have a place in which it's possible for them to retrain so that they can go up the product cycle themselves and so on. In other words, some of their claims we have to understand and react to. So I think we must be a little bit careful with the illiberal side. And one final comment is, it goes back to what Professor Bieber said early on. What is Euroscepticism? Well, there are amusing paradoxes. Sometimes Euroscepticism says no more money to the European Union. Remember, the European Union has just a teeny budget of its own, 1% of European GDP, something like that. So sometimes Eurosceptics say no more Europe. But some of the most Eurosceptic countries, sometimes in the East, want to have quite a lot of money to improve their farmers, for structural adjustment funds of one sort or another. So there's a paradox, less money, but also more money for us. So there's great struggle, and that struggle will always go on. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Thanks for a very interesting comment, Givi. Very briefly. Thank you. I will start from general question, which is a definition of nationalism. So Dr. Hall and Dr. Bieber talked about it, and they define it. That's why I'm not doing the same. I just want to very briefly briefly address now the nationalist or nativist populism. So in populism, it is a vertical contradiction between the people and the elite. But in case of nativism, people and elites, the way they are structured, they are standing on the base of ethnical and cultural identity, and that's why it is called nativist populism, because the way it is perceived among people, for instance, in case of Georgia, like Orthodox Christian, ethnic Georgian, conservative, horizontally it is exclusive, because, for instance, migrants or sexual minorities, they are not seen as part of the people. To the contrary, they are viewed as the threat to the Georgian identity. Otherwise, like different demonstrations of nationalism, sometimes they could be more exclusive, more inclusive, or less inclusive, civic or ethnic. Euroscepticism and the term Euroscepticism, I would also like to comment on that. So there is there's no one clear meaning and it's also very difficult to generalize, because whatever Euroscepticism means in Austria, the same is not the case in Georgia, for instance. You cannot really copy and paste that. And also the discussion in European member states is shaped in a different way compared to Georgia. And the term and the concept itself is very much depending on the context. It's quite ambiguous. It's not clear, and there's a lot of debate about where is the end of the innocent criticism towards Europe, and where is the beginning of a very strong Euroscepticism. You cannot really see that line. There was a question, but I couldn't get the meaning of the question. It was about the parties being fragmented and also the social basis. But from whatever I got for the question, I can say that in the Georgia and also in post-Soviet environment, the parties are not really solid. They're very soft, and the social basis is really shaking and shattered. In Western world, the parties were building themselves from bottom up, but in Georgia, the contrary happened. After we regained our independence, there was no social basis. It was the top-down building of a party. But if we compare Georgia to other post-Soviet half-democracies like Moldova, Ukraine, etc., for instance, in case of Moldova and Ukraine, you can say that their level of democracy is almost the same. From their perspective, Georgia's political system, you cannot say that it's fragmented. It's quite solid, but again, it depends on the context. Keta, yeah, I also want to comment on the terminology, because we faced a lot of problem when we were working on the topic. We were using nationalism, ultra-nationalism, but they were telling us that you need to use fascism or pro-Russianism, etc. And also the 90s movements in Georgia, they were called nationalist movements. Liberation movements were called nationalist movements, and to some extent, these two different terms, they became sort of synonyms. But again, when we talk about nationalist policies and modern ultra-nationalist policy of Georgia, or if we talk about any other political issue that has something to do with international politics or geopolitics, you have to translate it in a very accurately and correctly. And when you translate it, and to translate it like word for word, ultra-nationalism, the way the information comes to them and also is translated, and they translate and they try to adjust it to like national symbols, family, traditions, etc., whatever symbols they imagine themselves as the protectors of. So that's why the terminology is important, not only nationalism, but also the term Euroscepticism. And as many things affect the understanding of the terminology, it is the country, the region, the international environment, all the political developments happening, everything has an impact on the way we understand the terms. Because when we started working on our papers, we had a different understanding. We believed it is just an attitude towards European Union, and we believed that these groups were against Euro integration. But last year, end of year, when we were about to finish our research, we found that these groups, to the contrary, they support membership into the European Union, and in their statements, they use it like, as all European ultranationals, the way it happens in the European Union, which means that this terminology is so volatile, and it keeps changing in line with the events that are very much changing and diverse in each respective country, and it is important to consider. And also another problem that we faced, for instance, when international political events are being covered in Georgia, it is so fragmented, and again is linked with the support coming from the European Union or the important decision made. So, and it's not really like a systemic and a comprehensive coverage of the European Union and the issues in Georgia. There is always some gap remaining, and then those groups, they take advantage of the gaps and they try to fill it in with whatever suits them. Thank you. Salome, maybe we can move to the second round of questions. We have several questions waiting for us, and they are free to ask questions themselves. So Nino Samkharadze, we can give the floor to you now. Second, it is David Matsaberidze, one question, because we already asked one of his questions, which was provided in writing, just one. And then Renata will have a question. And the fourth one from Stanislav. It would be very good if first Florian Bieber is given the possibility to answer, because he has to go to a defense. So you'll be the first to answer, and then free to go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for really very engaging comments from all of the speakers. So relatively, I have my first question to Dr. Bieber and Dr. Hall. Do you see the Euroscepticism within Europe influencing on the kind of inter-citizenship or globalized image of the EU specifically? How do you see it, the common value idea of European Union? Is it under danger? Is it under some threats as a result of increasing some Eurosceptic powers within European countries? This is my first question. And secondly, very briefly, I wanted to ask to Katie about her and her colleagues' research. Did you observe somehow how engaging those social media accounts or material or whatever they publish, are they increasingly engaging for the Georgian spectrum, for the Georgian population, if you have observed somehow? Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Oh, it's my turn?
Yes.
Thank you to all panelists for your thoughtful speeches and comments. And the first answers was, the first question was already answered by Professor Bieber, and the second question was going to Professor John Hall. As I was listening to your points, I wonder whether you can provide judgments that is just to expand your position on identities and loyalties and those fractured political public in the European Union, and especially in the context of the Central Eastern European countries, as long as I would argue that it's split not only in terms of that national lines, but also in terms of political and economic lines as well. Well, if we look at those who are coming under the rubric, let's say, of liberal regimes and champions of liberal democracies, let's take Orban or Kaczynski or Fico, they are split with the Brussels not in terms of economic, because they would like to get that economic benefits, but in terms of politics and waging their national political lines on behalf of their government towards their in the name of their constituencies. So, what would be your reflection in this context?
Is there another question coming, or
Renata?
Maybe we give question to Stanislav Kileti before Renata comes.
Okay.
Mr. Kileti, are you asking a question? Because you had a question written. Are you here?
Stanislav is muted.
I know, but he has to unmute.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, now, okay. Thank you. Sorry for the technical issues. I would like to ask a double question. Reacting to the presentation of Dr. Bieber, well, regarding increasing seats of the European Parliament by nationalist parties and the idea of changing Europe from within, of course, these changes have been rather gradual, but in your opinion, is this in some way the institutionalizing effect of the European Union? Have these parties changed from within because of being part of the system and becoming part of the system? And another question somewhat related as well is, do you see any prospects, any possibilities for the nationalist parties to build joint platforms in the future, even now, if now they're spread across the political spectrum?
Thank you. Is there any more question, Inuta? Because we are short.
I think we can start with
Okay, Professor Bieber.
Thanks. These are good and also very difficult questions to answer easily. So I think, of course, the parties we've been talking about, are they questioning the kind of the underlying values of the European Union? I think we have to distinguish two things. First of all, we have far-right political parties which espouse an exclusionary nationalist agenda. Now, they are often also, I would say, anti-democratic, or they're often also questioning basic premises of liberal democracy. So I think we have to, and I agree with John Hall that we have to be careful with the terminology, that I still believe illiberal political parties is a useful category, but we have to not assume that a nationalist or exclusionary nationalist party is inherently illiberal, or that illiberal parties inherently are nationalists. These are separate phenomena which often coincide for good reason, but they're not always intrinsically linked. And when I say illiberal, basically meaning that they reject some basic premises of a liberal democracy, which includes rule of law, or which includes minority protection. When I say minority protection, not just of national minorities, but of all kinds of, be it sexual minorities or be it political minorities. We often find a coincidence that exclusionary nationalist parties, Eurosceptic parties, are also against liberal democracy because they espouse an idea of what is understood in the literature on populism, the idea that there's a volonté générale, a will of the people, which this party reflects, and that basically all other parties are inherently either treacherous or not reflecting the will of the people. I mean, the basic premise of populism is anti-elitism, and the idea that they are the sole, or main at least, legitimate representative of the people. And I think this is something inherently complicating democracy, because democracy assumes not just institutional sides, but that the actors accept that the other actors are legitimate representatives of the electorate. So that you might not agree with their opinions or their policies, but that you accept their legitimacy. Populists generally are defined by rejecting this. And this, of course, is inherently in conflict with EU values in that sense. So I think in that sense, you could say that these kind of parties are questioning the European Union, not just from the kind of exclusionary nationalist perspective, but very often also by rejecting some of the basic premises. And also the other point is the EU is inherently a consensus-seeking institution. The basic understanding of the European Union is that it tries to build consensus among multiple actors. It's not a majoritarian institution. It does not claim to speak on the name of one people. And the EU cannot function if it's staffed or decision-making is done by political actors who are inherently against seeking consensus. Because the EU can never, in terms of its formal decision-making, but also otherwise not work on opposing its will against the will of an important minority, whether it's a number of countries, a number of political actors, and so on. So there's a kind of intense conflict there, which I think is good, because the European Union cannot be hijacked by populist illiberal actors, because it will disappear rather than be hijacked. And the last point about the coherence of far-right political parties and their success. First of all, the success of these parties in the European Parliament is particularly worrying, I find, because usually the European Parliament elections are always seen as a site of second-tier elections, where voters in the past have often voted for more radical political options than they would in national elections, because they felt the risk was lower. You can, in a certain way, send a signal to your national government at the European Parliament election with little cost. So the fact that this number has risen means it rose from a much higher level than usually national political parliamentary elections had these parties. The fragmentation, I think, is likely to persist because, again, we do have parties which are, on the violence endorsing spectrum to parties which are very eager to seek and achieve recognition by the center. But I think what we should mostly focus on is not the freak show obsession often with scholars of populism or far right is the extremists, but rather the way in which these ideas have become mainstreamed and how they've entered big party families. So, anti-immigrant, the toleration, for example, for the idea that migrants should be not accepted in Europe and that it's legitimate to defend borders even if migrants die in boats in the Mediterranean, that this has become normalized, the way in which the European external border functions, is something which is the kind of mainstreaming of many of those ideas. And I think that is much more dangerous than focusing exclusively on the parties which might grab headlines, but which are not the ones who are actually setting government policies.
Thank you very much. Professor John Hall, the floor is yours.
I had a couple of comments, being in agreement with what Florian Bieber has just said. One is the European Union somehow falling apart? I don't think so. The European Union goes from crisis to crisis. I do suspect that Britain's behavior in the last years and what is about to happen to Britain economically will be an enormous force for reaffirming the solidarity of the Union. Britain has given a dreadful example which will help Europe. But the normal situation of crisis and then crisis overcome, the Italians were furious because they didn't get much help at the beginning of COVID-19. But Europe has managed to produce a package cleverly designed, reacting to it. So I don't see the European Union as falling apart. Years ago, I was in Paris and there were Frexit signs all over the place. That has indeed gone. It's not like that anymore. Second thing is, as with Katie Satania, I do indeed think that the word nationalism is constantly a struggle. All countries have struggles over what their national identity is going to be. I remember one occasion years ago when the national identity was almost held by the Conservative Party. And Tony Blair, those days, very impressive, gave a speech in which he said, "We are the nation. The nation is not those symbols that they're making so much of. It's the people's home," and so on. So there's always a struggle about national identity, and working out exactly what is being meant by any particular group at particular moments is enormously important. But we can't manage without the word all the same. There was a question I didn't quite understand, which is that besides economic matters, there are political struggles going along too. Well, of course, I'm a sociologist, so sometimes I want to see how those economic divisions lead into different political matters. But political matters, religious identities and so on can have their own autonomy for sure, I wouldn't deny that. I think those things are present as well. In general, I think that people don't pay quite enough attention to class issues when thinking about nationalism. They tend to see it just as a political thing. So I'd like to keep the emphasis on class in the discussion, but wouldn't necessarily say that it's the only thing that matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that Professor Biber has to leave. If you have to leave, I would like to thank you very much, and we will try to keep in touch with you. So yeah, it was very important contribution from your side, and we really appreciated your contribution.
Thank you very much.
Having said that, I would like to give the floor to Givi and Keta for very brief, because we are running behind of time. So Givi, if you have any concluding remarks.
So very briefly, I would like to mention that the understanding of the term Euroscepticism in Georgia does not depend on the contextual issues, because it's quite dichotomic, and also in the political groups and also political environment. Again and again, it is about like a pro-integration. That is why Euroscepticism definition is also very specific to Georgia. And oftentimes in political discourse and also in media discourse, all the terminology is a subject of a great confusion, like Eurosceptic, anti-European, pro-European, anti-Russian. It is like a big mess, like a big black box, which is weird and also quite damaging. And as I was talking about nationalist populism and nativist populism, there is this Kazmunde statement, and I like it very much because it very clearly demonstrates this right nativist populist attitude. So the whole movement is a democratic non-liberal answer to a non-democratic liberal movement. So the response is non-liberal but democratic. The response to liberal but non-democratic groups. So this is a very clear definition. Katie? She's muted, but she keeps talking. So like brief two comments I want to propose. So first, the answer to Nino's question. So what is the impact of the Facebook posts on the overall attitude? So it is very much manipulating, and they try to manipulate with the reader's ideas. And I can give you one example. Oftentimes they use some visual aids, and we were able to also analyze visuals. And there was like a lot of pictures of women in Muslim clothes, and there was this definition that these women dressed as Muslim, like all covered up, that was tapping on the first flag of democratic Georgia. A totally different context. They try to bring them all together, and it's impossible to double check and see if it was true or not. And that's why it's so easy to manipulate with all the information, especially in Facebook.
where oftentimes all you read is like a statement, like a headline, and that's it. Second, what I want to say is about political parties. We also had a problem. We were researching it, and we found that majority of the political parties in Georgia, in order to mobilize their voters, they try to use a lot of words of Europe, European, and they try to fill up all of their statements with these words, and there is no other space left for some meaningful and thoughtful ideas. And then it became subject of attacks. But at the same time, we see the gap, like a niche, which was immediately taken by these nationalist political parties, which Gibi was describing to you. And they are also making a very good use of the Euro integration benefits and European policy perspectives and benefits. The second thing that I want to talk about, the attitudes among people. You can see it in a daily life. You can see how important the understanding of Europe, of the European Union is. You can see it, and it's easy. In marketing, for instance, if you sell something, you see euro in the beginning of something you really want to sell, and it sells, like euro remodeling of the apartment, euro product. So, and it sells. So it is now here in our daily life, but in politics, it's less pertinent. It's more rare, and we do not really strongly follow that spirit in the political environment. Euroscepticism is not strong among people and also among the nationalist groups, but those manipulators, they make a very good use of that. But in the long run, it's really difficult to say something and to give some forecast, because the terminology is so volatile. It's changing permanently, and we are still in the context of pandemics, and you can say nothing about tomorrow. So thank you, Katie. I totally agree with you, but there is just one thing we fail to achieve, which is the European punctuality. And our webinar is a good example of that, because we've been 9 minutes over the time that we were supposed to end. Thank you all. Thanks for a very interesting discussion, and I do hope that in future we will have the possibility to continue cooperation with the panel members, also with other participants, and this series of the webinars continue, and we hope to meet you in future on different topics. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. So we go, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again.
Pleasure to meet you all. Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks. Bye.